Oh, hello. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you guys got a chance to enjoy the lovely weekend. I'm filming this on Sunday and it's beautiful, and I got sun farmer's tan. So we are living our best life right now. And I got my blue light glasses. So really thriving. Today, we're going to get started reviewing Unit 2, the bio unit. This is one of the bigger units. Typically, I'd like to start by going over the nervous system and neurons because those are the building blocks of kind of how we communicate through different brain parts. But since I'm doing the Kahoot review, I thought it would be good on the parts of the brain because I know you guys really wanted to review that. I thought it would be good to start with the brain part functions so you have that review before going into the Kahoot. So today we're going to cover the functions of. So let's hit the different areas of the brain first. I'm going to take it from old to new, or from very basic and simple to more complex and more evolved. So the older ones, think kind of the basic things that we had when we were in the cavemen stage, right? So up first, we have the brainstem and cerebellum. And because these are kind of the most simple, basic parts of the brain, they maintain our essential functions. So if these are damaged, you really are going to have some problems. So this includes things like our spinal cord is the main part of the nervous system. We have the brainstem, medulla in here. The pons is kind of the bridge between the brainstem to the rest of the brain. Uh, and then we have the cerebellum is the mini brain that's kind of attached next to the brainstem. So let's get started with the functions. The best way we know to remember these is by the different mnemonic devices that we can come up with. So I provided my own, but feel free to make up your own if they work better for you. So up first, we have the medulla, and the medulla is responsible for breathing and heart rate. Big one is breathing, and the easiest way that I think to remember that is through Medusa, if you know her from like Greek mythology. She's the one who had snakes for hair, and she would essentially turn people to stone. And if you're turned to stone, you can't breathe. Or you can think that she has the snakes coming out of her hair, and then the snakes can choke you, and you can't breathe. Anyway, again, medulla, Medusa, breathing. Pons, easy. Pillow pons, because the pons is connected to sleep and regulating your sleep patterns. And it's also the bridge to the cerebellum. So you can think like a bridge over a pond, ponds. So pillow, pons, it's connected to sleep. So if you had a damage to that, you might have issues when it comes to sleeping patterns. Reticular formation. This is with alertness, arousal, and being awake. So reticular formation, this you can think tick, 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 tick. Alarm clock, it keeps you ticking, alert, aroused, and awake. Tick, tick, tick formation. Cerebellum, we said cerebellum because you could think you could play basketball with your cerebellum because it's related to movement, coordination, like being able to go on a balance beam, and your balance. You need to be coordinated and balanced in order to play sports, things like gymnastics, basketball. But not only does it do like gross motor movements, which are big sweeping movements that you'd use in like sports, but also it could coordinate fine motor movements like typing or texting or writing with a pencil. And then we have our thalamus, and this isn't really an official part of the brain stem. It's kind of situated at the top. So the thalamus, remember, I have hounded this 120 times. It processes all sensory information except what? Smell. Everything except smell. Because smell has its own little funky part called the olfactory bulb. And we'll learn more about that when we review sensation and perception. So thalamus, remember, I love my little Buddy the Elf analogy. So when an elf, just think of the mailroom. The thalamus isn't processing, it's not like the last final place to process your sensory information. It's just taking a pit stop in the thalamus. It's the mailroom. So all the different sensations from touch, taste, hearing, they're all flying into the mailroom of the thalamus. and then they have to get organized. So the thalamus has to say, okay, here's something that's an auditory sensation. Oh, I'm going to send it now to the temporal lobe. And you put it up in the little sucky male thing. So again, just think of it as a mailroom. It's all coming in, all the different sensory information, and then they have to say whether it's going to go, okay, it's visual, it's going to go to the occipital lobe. It's auditory, okay, going to go to the temporal lobe. Boom, boom, boom. They organize it, and then it gets fully processed in those specific processing areas like the temporal lobe with the auditory cortex. Okay. The next part is our limbic system. So you can see it's kind of this little area here. So you have amygdala, you have the hippocampus, and you have the hypothalamus. So limbic system, it's a lot to do with kind of memory and motivation and emotion kind of stuff. So think like Unit 6 and Units up, or Unit 5 and Unit 6. So we know hippocampus has to do with memory. Specifically, the formation of new memories is what it's mainly tied with. So that's why when we see something like Clive Wearing or HM, it's really their ability to make the brand new memories and save those that's damaged. So that's why people like Clive and HM, they are kind of stuck in the present because they can't really form new memories and keep living their life in a normal way. So hippocampus is memory. And remember, if you saw a hippo on East Campus, oh my gosh, you'd never forget it. It's tied in with memory. Hypothalamus, that is what I said when I was at Culver's. It's kind of your thermostat or head control center or taking temperatures, because it's monitoring the body to make sure that it's maintaining homeostasis, which is that balance and equilibrium. And it's also connected to the endocrine system, which is our hormone system, kind of the opposite of our nervous system. And it's connected to this so it can, tell the endocrine system to, hey, produce some hormones because we need to maintain balance. So I said at Culver's, I took temps with my little thermometer, and I had to make sure all the soups, all the custard, whatever, was at the correct temperature. And if it wasn't, I had to mark, say I adjusted it, turned it hotter, or turned it colder. And that's exactly what the hypothalamus does. It makes sure that the body's at equilibrium. So if it isn't, it's going to notify the endocrine system, specifically the pituitary gland, which is right here. So look, hypothalamus is here. It's conveniently located real close to that pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is the master gland of the endocrine system. So if hypothalamus sees that you're hungry or that something's off, it's going to then notify pituitary gland to pass that message on to the whole endocrine system and release the hormones or things that are needed to rebalance the body out. Okay, then we got amygdala. So you can think of that. It's fear, anger, aggression, right? So we have angry, Amy, anything, right? Angry, amygdala. The guy said avigdala because it's scary. So amygdala is very important in forming those meaningful memories with fear, and also kind of your fight or flight response if you're feeling scared, that kind of a thing. So amygdala, just remember fear, anger, aggression. And there was the interesting case of the person who didn't experience fear because their amygdala was damaged. And we said that's actually probably a bad thing because you can't protect yourself. If you can't feel fear, fear is almost a good thing. It's an adaptive thing. So interesting example there. Then we have the most kind of highly complex, the newest, most evolved part of our brain, which is the cerebral cortex. And if you think back to the video with our little dorky friend, he says cortex equals complex, because that's where your complex thinking happens. It's the highest part of the brain, which you can also remember it's kind of the top, most important when it comes to thinking, complex thinking stuff. So cortex equals complex. And within this, it contains our different lobes. So cortex is kind of up here. And it would cover the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. So those 4 important lobes that we need to know. And this is what makes humans unique, is that we have this cortex area where we can use our complex thinking that other animals obviously do not have those same capabilities. Just a note of something good to know. So in the cerebral cortex, I said there's the different lobes and things. There's association areas. And these are regions on the cerebral cortex that aren't responsible for either sensory or motor functions. So we know something like parietal, occipital, temporal lobe. Those are very much with different sensory functions, right? We have hearing, we have vision, we have touch, taste, temperature over here with parietal. So association areas are areas that aren't responsible for sensory or motor functions, but are instead related to higher level thinking, right? A lot going on in the frontal lobe, including language. And that's where we have the Broca's area and Wernicke's area, right? Those are very related to language, higher level thinking, cognition. And those are located, those would be considered an association area located in the cerebral cortex. And then reasoning. So I'll talk more about these once we get in here. So we'll get started with our 4 lobes, and within the 4 lobes, right, these are very big areas. So they have big sweeping functions, but then there's also smaller areas that are more specialized within those. And they kind of make sense when you're understanding, oh, okay, so frontal lobe is like decision making. Oh, that's because the prefrontal cortex is located in it. Or, okay, parietal lobe is touch, temperature, taste. Oh, that makes sense because somatosensory cortex processes touch and movement. So let's break it down real quick. We'll start with our 4 big main lobes. So up first, we have the frontal lobe. And this is the one where like the more thinking, higher level of any of these lobes are going on. So frontal lobe, you can think higher level thinking, judgment, decision-making, speech, language, and movement. And that's a lot of functions, right? Because it's a big area and it contains smaller parts of the brain within that. So you can think thinking is the big thing here. Prefrontal cortex is just really anything tied with cognition, really, in here, because speech and language we also know is something cognitive. So prefrontal cortex is what we said that adolescents or teenagers often don't have developed fully until later because it's one of the parts of the brain that fully develops last. So prefrontal cortex, we know, is decision making is the big one. Judgment, reasoning skills, impulse control. And that's why we say that teenagers often do not fully have these, as you guys might know, because you're still developing. So that's what I said, that you can tell mom and dad next time you do something stupid, well, oh, my prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, so my decision-making skills aren't all there. And also contained within the frontal lobe, because it has part of that language capability, is the Broca's area. So Broca, remember, we thought broken speech, and someone also said boca is in the Spanish word for mouth, because Broca's area is responsible for actual production of speech and being able to talk and have words come out of your mouth. So if you damage your Broca's area, you can't produce speech. So you might be able to understand and comprehend it, and like you'd want to be able to say something, but you can't move the muscles and things that are important in being able to actually produce sound and speech. We said Wernicke's area is the one that's actually responsible for comprehending or understanding speech. So if you have that damaged, you could have words come out of your mouth, but they're going to be like gibberish and not make sense. So next part of the frontal lobe is then the motor cortex. And that makes sense because we said what's involved? Movement is part of the frontal lobe. So motor cortex, right? Anytime you hear motor, you can just think movement. Motor movement. And that's your voluntary movements. So movements like moving your arm and things you have to consciously think about to do. And then we have our parietal lobe. So I said that's like the 3 T's you can remember: touch, temperature, taste. And then it's also kind of those spatial relationships and awareness. So kind of understanding where you are in kind of a room and orienting yourself in regards to your space. So here, little finger touching something, you can think touch sensations, T, touch, temperature, taste. Just remember those and put that all together. Occipital lobe is vision, and that's easy to remember because O, open your eyes, O, optical, occipital, optical. So pretty easy to remember. And within here, I should note, is the visual cortex, which is even more specific to processing vision. Then we have our temporal lobes. And I think a lot of you guys sometimes mix up parietal, temporal, and things like that. Temporal, just think your temples are here, your ears are here. They're right next door. So temporal, temples, ear. So it's auditory, sounds, and speech, and then also has the language comprehension speech. So we said frontal lobe is language production and making speech. Temporal is understanding and comprehending it. So Wernicke's area is your ability to comprehend and understand language. And if that's damaged, right, you could have words come out of your mouth, but it's gibberish because you don't understand them. And then you can think even this one last thing more specifically within temporal lobe would be like auditory cortex, where you're like ultimately finally producing or processing your auditory information. Okay, so that was a whole lot of stuff. So make sure you're going through just kind of making those mnemonic devices and practicing. The brain parts, once you have them memorized, are really easy because it's very easy to say, okay, hippocampus is memory. Well, here's an FRQ question about so-and-so damaged their hippocampus. What's going to happen? Oh, he's going to not be able to make new memories, blah, blah, blah. So it's very easy once you have them memorized. So take some time to do that. Another important thing to note is that thinking big picture, our brain has two hemispheres, right? We have our, I'm going to be opposite now, but we have our left and our right hemisphere. So these are lateralized. And what it means for something to be lateralized is that they're controlled, that the different hemispheres have different functions. So each hemisphere has kind of its own unique function that's just unique to, the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. So good thing to know is what functions are controlled by each hemisphere. And remember, we debunked that whole left-right brain thing is, oh, if you're right-brained, you're more creative. We know that that's not true, but we do know that there are some lateralized functions, but not to the same thing of, oh, you're more creative or analytical in this one. So what functions are controlled by the left hemisphere? First, we know that the hemispheres are contralateral, and that what's processed in your right hemisphere processes things from the left side of your body. And your left hemisphere processes things from the right side of your body, including visual things. So if you're seeing something on the left, it's going to get processed in the right. If you're touching something in the left, it's going to get processed in the right. So contralateral. So things in the left hemisphere would control things on the right side of your body. A specific function that's really unique to the left hemisphere is language and speech. And that makes sense because the Broca's and Wernicke's areas are located in the left hemisphere of the brain. So language and speech, unique to the left. And you can remember that, L, language, left. And then perception of touch as well, like I said, on the from the right side of the body, it's processed in the left. And then what functions are controlled by the right hemisphere? Right would control left, it's contralateral. And then we said the right is more about visual spatial awareness. So kind of seeing visual things and drawing and looking at things. And then also recognizing faces and emotional responses. So you could talk about face blindness and things like that. It's interesting because that part is a little bit more controlled by the right hemisphere. So we talk about split brain patients, and that's when their corpus callosum is severed. And we said that typically we don't really need to think about, oh, right controls left, left controls right, right's more visuospatial, left's more language oriented. We don't need to think about that because our corpus callosum, the bundle of neural fibers that's connecting the brain's left and right hemispheres, works instantaneously. So they can communicate, milliseconds, instant. They're all communicating. So we don't need to think about, oh, well, the right controls this, left controls that, because that's all happening instantaneously. But we said that people who had really severe seizures, probably over 30 years ago, because they have better treatments now, would have their corpus callosum severed and cut. And what happened is that these people then become split brain patients, in which for the most part they live normal lives, but there's a few times in which we saw it was hard for them to kind of do certain tasks because their brains couldn't communicate the left. Okay, so we know that again, the hemispheres are contralateral in that the left hemisphere processes things from the right side of the body, including things seen in the right visual field, so from his right eye. And we know that the right hemisphere would process things from the left side of the body, including his left field of vision, his left eye. So let's break this picture down here. It kind of shows what's going on with these split brain patients. So here, he is saying the word ring. And that's because his from his right field of vision, he is seeing the word ring. And we know that since it's on the right field of vision, it's getting processed in the left hemisphere. Remember, LL, left language. So he is able to speak and say the word ring because it's on the right field of vision, contralateral, processed in the left hemisphere. Left is language. Then we have the right hemisphere is processing the stuff going on in his left field of vision. So he has the word key to the left here, but he can't say it because this is, again, contralateral. He sees it in the left field of vision, processed in the right hemisphere. Right hemisphere is for visuospatial things, not language. So he cannot, for the life of him, say the word key, but he can hold it and he could draw it. Most likely, we'll see in the videos, because it's visuospatial. So it's kind of those two separate, he has kind of two separate brains going on, which is really interesting. He doesn't really know, he can't say what he sees, but then asked to draw a picture of it and recreate it, he could. And that's because, again, right is visuospatial and left is language. So very interesting example. There's a good video that I'll show. I think I have the link down here that you can watch on your own that breaks it down a little bit more. So next, final thing with kind of parts of the brain is an important term. What's going on? Important term called neuroplasticity. So from our case studies of people like Phineas Gage and H.M., Clive Waring, people who have had really serious damage to parts of the brain, the woman without fear damaging her amygdala, we see that, you can have some pretty drastic changes from just damaging one part of the brain. Damaging something like the hippocampus could really, really alter your life in a negative way. But we also see that our brain is very adaptable. And there's this term called neuroplasticity. And this basically says that our brain has the ability to reorganize itself by continually forming new neural connections. We're always kind of learning new things and forming these new connections between neurons and continuing to grow and adapt. So neuroplasticity because we're forming these new neural connections, also allows the brain to compensate or kind of repair after an injury. So because of these new neural connections, you can really kind of adapt and sometimes take over functions. So maybe something was damaged and now another part can take over that previous function and make new neural connections and compensate in that way. So the best example of neuroplasticity is with this sweet little girl that we watched who had those really, really terrible seizures. And they took out a whole hemisphere of her brain. And she was able to, through neuroplasticity, kind of teach, I forget which, it was the left hemisphere, teach that one hemisphere to kind of compensate for the things that were lost when they took out the other hemisphere of her brain. So knowing that, again, the contralateral, she woke up paralyzed in one half of her body because they took out the one hemisphere. So she had to, through neuroplasticity, form those new neural connections and kind of compensate and reteach the remaining hemisphere of the brain how to do the other activities that the missing hemisphere once did. So our brain, moral of the story, is very adaptable. So now let's quickly cover the basics of sleep. So one good term to know is circadian rhythm. And this is our biological clock. It's kind of our 24-25-hour sleep-wake cycle. And it's kind of the reason why we tend to feel awake during the day and sleepy at night, even if you are on kind of a funky, work schedule or something like that. And the big important, okay, so let's go over our stages of sleep. So we have the 3 non-REM sleeps, and then we have REM sleep, which is a very different kind of stage. So remember, first, before I go over these, that this is a cycle. So you might go through something like non-REM 2 or 3 multiple times during your 8 hours of sleep, your 8-hour sleep cycle. So let's get started. First, we have non-REM 1. This is just your kind of initial falling asleep stage. So this stage probably only happens once if you're someone who's sleeping throughout the night fully and not getting up. So non-REM 1, this is, again, the initial falling asleep, and it's characterized by slow breathing and irregular brain waves. You also might feel things like hallucinations or like you're falling or weightless. The example I give with this is when I'm up late, I was in college studying, I'd be in my little comfy chair and I'd be in the middle of reading something and then I'd feel myself drifting off and I'd notice kind of the hallucinations because I'd be reading something on the page and then my brain starts going into kind of like sleep mode and what I'm reading starts turning into some weird dream and then I'm like falling asleep. So that's kind of the initial falling asleep, and that typically just happens one time. Then once you're clearly asleep, you get into non-REM 2. And big thing about this stage is sleep spindles happen. And these are just kind of random bursts of brain activity that are kind of sporadic during this stage. You can see here, let's look at our brain waves. So non-REM 2, it might be kind of this little jolt here. So it's kind of staying the same, then you have kind of a little burst. Then non-REM 3, this is kind of your deeper sleep, and this is when slow delta waves occur, right? So you think deep sleep delta, deep delta. So these are slow deep waves for your deep sleep. And then during this stage is when a lot of things like sleepwalking, talking, night terrors, childhood bedwetting, all these types of things occur. And it's really because you're in that deeper sleep right now. So then, because it's, again, a cycle, you might drift back to something like non-REM 2. Then the big stage you'll hit is REM sleep. And this one's probably the most important one to know for AP. They like to ask about it. So REM sleep stands for rapid eye movement. And that is because if you were to lift up the eyelids of someone during REM sleep, you would see their eyes darting back and forth. This is when your kind of dreaming sleep happens. But but it's also called a paradoxical sleep because even though you're in your kind of really intense sleep here, you are having your heart rate up, you going through rapid breathing, and your eyes are moving. So it's almost kind of paradoxical. It looks like you're awake. If you were to look at, let's see, if you were to look at the REM waves, you'd see it's essentially the same as kind of an awake person. So pretty interesting. It's paradoxical in that even though you're in kind of a deep sleep, you are very much on paper, if you were to look at the waves, looking like you're very awake and alert. And also during this time, you might have your body is paralyzed. You can't really move because you're in such a deep kind of rest. So big thing to know is that it's rapid eye movement going on, and that the waves look essentially like you're awake, and that your heart rate's up, your breathing's up, and things like that. Okay. So that is mainly it. For tonight, I just want you guys to review through those brain functions. That's kind of the big thing. And I know a lot of people who are asking about things they wanted in our review wanted to go over those brain parts and way to remember those. So my biggest advice for you is just making your flashcards, making mnemonic devices that work for you, and just feeling really confident on those brain parts. Because if you know them, once you know them, it's really easy to apply them. And that's kind of a good way to score points if they ask about them on the AP FRQ. So awesome. Study up for your Kahoot challenge tomorrow. It'll be good. Have a nice day, you guys. I am going to go hammocking and take on the world. I'm very excited.